Melissa stood in her office, confident of her victory. She had overpriced the house for Jonathan and Laura Williams, a young black family, hoping they wouldn't be able to afford it. She was already anticipating their disappointment, but when the call came the next morning, her world came crashing down. They hadn't just bought a house, they'd bought her company. The racism and bias she'd thought insignificant had turned on her in the most brutal way. What happened next shook her to the core. But let's start at the beginning. Melissa Rogers was a realtor with an impeccable reputation. Her name was a household name, and her clients often spoke of her as a professional they could trust. But behind the facade of impeccable behavior was another person. She learned to be persuasive, to say what was necessary, to pretend to care about her clients' needs, and, of course, to always find ways to get her percentage. Success and money is what motivated her. She knew how to manipulate situations, to read people, knowing when to gently nudge them in the direction of the right decision and when to leave them in the dark to take her reward in the end. Her office in Boston was decorated with exquisite taste, expensive paintings, pictures of satisfied clients posing in brand new homes, with shining eyes, and signed thank you notes. It looked like success, the perfect picture for everyone who entered the office. But behind all those smiles was another truth. Melissa knew that in reality she was often deceitful, not always able to sincerely help clients, but her experience and intuition always told her how to play on people's weaknesses and needs, turning them into hostages of the market situation. She did everything for her own benefit, and there was nothing wrong with that. In her world, business was business, and people were just elements to be handled. When Jonathan and Laura Williams, a young black family with children, walked into her office, Melissa was startled. They looked so simple, so sincere, their eyes filled with hope and faith in a bright future. Jonathan was tall, with a confident posture, but his expression was a little wary, as if he sensed that things were not so simple. Laura was softer, her kind eyes didn't hide her excitement. She might not be as well versed in the intricacies of the market as her husband, but her movements and words showed that she trusted him, relying on his judgment. For Melissa, this was another typical case. They came in with a clearly stated goal, to buy a home that would fit their requirements and capabilities. But something about their appearance alerted the realtor. She felt that these people might be too naive or, on the contrary, too ambitious for this transaction. She knew all too well how often such families, especially those with limited financial resources, tried to do the impossible, to take on mortgage obligations they could not pull off. This house overlooking the park is the best I can offer you. And it's worth $650,000. You won't find anything better on this market. Her voice sounded confident, and she didn't even try to hide her inner superiority. She watched their faces, scrutinizing every expression their emotions might give off. Jonathan frowned slightly, and Laura sighed. It was what Melissa had expected, a couple perhaps unable to realize that this house was too expensive for them, that they were unlikely to be able to pull off such an expense. Melissa felt her confidence only growing. Her intuition was telling her that they wouldn't be able to afford this house, which meant she would keep looking for options that wouldn't work for them either. After all, she could just put them on hold for a while until they realized the gravity of the decision. That would give her time to find her next client, and maybe she'd still make money off of it. Melissa watched their reactions carefully, but she couldn't hide the slight feeling of satisfaction that arose inside. She was right, as always, the couple clearly couldn't afford this house. An almost imperceptible smile appeared on her face, the smile of someone who knew exactly how this meeting would end. Jonathan and Laura would likely leave in disappointment. It was just another day at her workplace, and she wasn't expecting anything unexpected. But the longer she watched them, the more she felt that something about the situation was wrong. Something she couldn't immediately recognize. Perhaps it was the expression in Laura's eyes, her hesitancy that hid some hidden resolve. Or Jonathan, who seemed to be struggling internally the whole time, assessing how things really were. Melissa began to feel her confidence beginning to fray at the seams. But she continued to play her part as she always did, confident that everything would be just as she had planned. You don't worry, it's a perfectly realistic price for a neighborhood like this. Houses like this go off the market quickly, she added, playing with the pen on the table. She had said those words so many times that she no longer realized how they sounded, they were just part of her pattern. But here was Laura, pressing her lips together and nodding as if deciding something. Melissa was about to continue, certain that they would leave and probably never come back. But something in their gaze made her think that this occasion might not be so ordinary. Something about this couple remained incompletely understood, and perhaps her inner calculations had failed her again. When Jonathan and Laura Williams returned to her office, Melissa didn't even think about what that might mean. She was sure everything would be just as it had been before. By now, she had complete confidence in her experience. This was her world, the Boston real estate market, where she manipulated prices with ease, played with people's feelings, and didn't let anyone question her decisions. In the end, she was always the one who controlled the situation, who ran the game, and the rest of them were just pawns. But as they entered the office, she felt her confidence begin to crack. Jonathan and Laura didn't look disappointed or depressed as she had expected. On the contrary, there was a determination burning in their eyes that made her wary. It wasn't something she usually saw in situations like this. They were back, and she didn't understand what was wrong with them. "We know this house is worth less. We want you to reconsider the offer." Jonathan's voice was firm but calm, as if he didn't doubt what he was saying. Melissa felt her heart skip a beat for a moment. This was something unexpected. How was this possible? She had believed that they, like so many others, would simply be frightened and leave. But instead they came with demands, with a willingness to fight for the justice she'd so confidently violated. All Melissa could feel now was a sharp irritation and even anger that was bursting out. How dare these people question her? In her world, no one could afford such impertinent moves. But outwardly, Melissa didn't give any sign of it. Like a seasoned professional, she instantly hid her emotions behind a neutral smile, pretending that nothing had happened. It was her only way to maintain control. She couldn't afford to panic, but her inner storm was almost unbearable. "I understand you want to renegotiate the price." She paused, choosing her words, carefully hiding the contempt that melted in her soul. "But as I said, this house with that view of the park simply can't be worth less. I've offered you the best terms on the market, and that's all I can do," she said, her voice sounding a little softer than usual, but there was a distinct note of arrogance in it. Laura stepped forward, her face still as determined as it had been when they'd entered the office. She didn't look away, and that look was a direct reminder to Melissa that she was no longer in control of the situation the way she used to be. These weren't just clients who would give up after a few words about a market price and unaffordable terms. These were people who had something more than just a desire to buy a house. They had pride, determination and, worst of all, knowledge she couldn't ignore. "We've checked, Melissa. We know it's overpriced by at least $100,000. We will not agree to those terms," Jonathan said firmly, no fear or doubt in his voice. Anger, like a dark cloud, thickened inside Melissa, but she again had to keep it to herself. She tried to smile again, as if to show them that they had no right to doubt her professionalism. But in the back of her mind a completely different thought was already resounding. Her decision was final. This family would not be part of her world, would not be one of those she would work with as equals. Their audacity was a boundary she couldn't allow to be crossed. "I'll make them," Melissa thought, "I'll make them realize they can't do this." But her smile didn't change and her voice remained calm despite the storm inside her. "If you want to continue the discussion, I can offer you other options, but this house is almost sold to other clients. I can't guarantee that you'll be able to find something in an equally good neighborhood." She paused, as if letting them know that this was their last chance. But Jonathan and Laura didn't give up. They stood in front of her, confident that they were right, despite her attempts to manipulate them. And the more she tried to hide her hatred, the more she felt her power begin to fray at the seams. Melissa felt her sense of control slipping away, her professionalism no longer being enough. She, who had always thought she could solve everything with words and cunning maneuvers, realized that her tricks weren't working here. "They don't quit, they don't give up. That was the moment she felt real hatred, not for these men, but for what they represented. Their determination, their knowledge, their tenacity threatened her worldview, her benefit. And all she could do was try to save face, to fight it with a sort of invisible smile, though a storm raged inside her. But she couldn't afford to lose. Several days passed, and all the while Melissa couldn't get the Williamses out of her mind. They hadn't given up. Not that she'd expected them to simply give in to her manipulations, but she'd never prepared for them to be so determined, so out of her control. These people were at odds with her world, and every move they made irritated her more and more. And then one ordinary evening, as Melissa was about to end her day's work, her phone suddenly rang. She picked up the phone, not expecting anything important as she usually did at the end of the work day. "Hello, this is your office secretary," said the voice on the other end of the line. "Sorry to disturb you, but your co-workers have relayed that you need to vacate the office. Jonathan and Laura Williams are now the owners of this building." Melissa froze. She didn't immediately realize what she had just heard. It was as if her heart clenched. Her breath caught, and no thought settled in her head. How was this possible? How could these people she'd tried to play a prank on be not just the buyers of a house, but the owners of her own business? With every word, her world was crumbling. "What did you say?" Her voice sounded like she couldn't believe her own ears. "I apologize, but you need to vacate the office. Please contact them for further instructions," the receptionist replied. Melissa felt her face go pale. All the confidence, all her power, all the manipulation she was so proud of, burned away in an instant. She, a professional with years of experience, found herself at a complete loss. She couldn't believe this was really happening to her. Instead of being the one in control, she had become the one who now had to meekly submit. This wasn't just defeat. It was humiliation. Everything she had built, her reputation, her confidence, her control over the situation, all those years spent keeping people in line suddenly crumbled. Instead of bringing others to their knees, she found herself in a position where she had to back down. She put the phone down, and for a few moments she sat there, unmoving, unsure of how she should even react. Anger raged inside her, but it was so overwhelmed by her horror and confusion that she couldn't do anything about it. How could she let herself be so wrong? How could she have underestimated their resolve? How had this scenario she herself had prescribed for them suddenly become her own nightmare? And yet, despite her inner storm, she could feel something breaking inside her. It wasn't just a feeling of a lost battle. It was a feeling of total loss of control, of what she had built, what she had achieved, what she considered her strength. She tried to think of something to get out of the situation, but the more she thought, the more she realized that her deception had been punished in ways she couldn't even imagine. Have I been so wrong all these years? Have I really lost touch with reality that much? These thoughts swarmed in her head like a swarm of wasps that would not settle down. Instead of finding a way out, she felt her world crumble right before her eyes. She had lost. And not just lost, but so hopelessly that now there was no turning back. She had lost not only her office, but her reputation. Everything she thought was her strength was just an illusion built on sand. That moment was a turning point. It wasn't just a defeat on the battlefield for money or status. It was a humiliation Melissa could barely endure. She stared at the phone as if it were the last symbol of her lost power. And suddenly it hit her, this wasn't just a real estate deal. This was a lesson. A lesson she had to learn, but one that was now her most painful reality. She hadn't just lost in the deal. She'd lost in the game itself. Melissa stood on the street, looking up at the building that had once been her kingdom. It was a place where she felt like an unquestioned authority, where her word meant more than that of any client. Now she stood at its doors as an outsider, merely watching new life fill those walls. The Williamses. Jonathan and Laura. They had entered her office, her world, with a pride that was so foreign to her. There wasn't the slightest shadow of doubt in their gaze. They were here to stay. Something inside her clenched. This whole process seemed like some kind of nightmare she couldn't control. But what irritated her most was not the loss of the business itself, but the fact that these inappropriate people, were able to so easily take what she had thought was hers for so long. The sight of their confident faces filled with determination gave her an unbearable sense of injustice. She couldn't understand how their struggle, their pursuit of truth, was disrupting her own world. But it was in that moment, as the pain of defeat reached its peak, that she realized her greed, her bias, her beliefs they were the cause of her downfall. She saw it clearly. In her desire to control everything and everyone, in the way she manipulated, used people, forgetting basic honesty, she had gone too far. It was her own sin. She was a victim of her lust for power and money. Meanwhile, the Williamses began to build a very different business based on principles that Melissa would never have accepted as her own. Their company became a role model in the real estate market. Jonathan and Laura didn't just keep the business going, they actively supported policies of inclusion and equality. They exposed the unfair and unacceptable practices that Melissa thought were the norm. They were outspoken against overcharging, manipulating clients, and excluding people who didn't fit their standard. Although their path was not an easy one, their determination and pursuit of fairness brought results. Soon the Williams Company became a model of ethical business practices, and the very story of their victory began to inspire others. They were doing what Melissa, despite her efforts, could not or would not do. They were changing the real estate market by refusing to be exploited and manipulated. And that change was visible and meaningful. Melissa, meanwhile, disappeared into the shadows. She was gone from the world she had once considered her own. Leaving a void behind her, she realized that her actions had resulted not only in a loss of business, but also a moral downfall. She could no longer return to a state where her decisions proved immutable. There was no room in her life for the satisfaction of victory or pride in her accomplishments. There was only the realization that her downfall was inevitable. And the Williamses became a symbol of how you can win, even if the whole world is against you, if you don't accept injustice and go your own way. This was their retribution, not so much revenge as restoring balance, the justice that Melissa had ignored for so long. There was no malice in their victory, only the certainty that good always wins, and that honesty and fairness are what ultimately brings real power. Melissa remained on the sidelines, looking out at the world she had once tried to control. And now, in that shadow, she began to realize that it was her own mistakes that caused her downfall. Whereas the Williamses, starting from scratch, managed to not only overcome the odds, but to make this world a better place.